At its peak, Rome controlled an economy worth the equivalent of 700 billion modern dollars. Its roads connected 3 continents. Its grain fed 70 million people. Its silver coin, the denarius, was the dollar of the ancient world, accepted from the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Britain. And then Rome destroyed it, not with an invasion, not with a plague, not even with political collapse. Rome destroyed its own currency. Slowly, deliberately, coin by coin, it melted away the very foundation of its wealth. And by the time anyone realized what had happened, a coin that was once 90% pure silver had become a bronze disc with a thin coat of paint. Here's the paradox that no textbook teaches you. Rome didn't go broke because it was poor. It went broke because it kept spending like it was rich. This is the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand how Rome destroyed its money, you first need to understand what made it extraordinary. In 211 BC, Rome was fighting for its life. Hannibal, the Carthaginian general who crossed the Alps with war elephants, had been terrorizing the Italian peninsula for years. Rome's treasury was depleted. Its allies were wavering. Its army needed paying. So Rome did something bold. It issued a new coin, the denarius. Named from the Latin word for 10, because it was initially worth 10 bronze asses, the denarius was struck from nearly pure silver, about 95% to be precise. It was heavy, it was trusted, and it was uniform. Every merchant from Alexandria to Antioch knew exactly what a denarius was worth. This mattered enormously. Before reliable coinage, trade was slow and expensive. You had to weigh metal, argue about purity, and trust strangers. A standardized silver coin changed everything. It was information. It was trust, made physical. Rome grew rich partly because its money worked. Soldiers were paid in denarii. Taxes were collected in denarii. Grain, silk, spices, all priced in denarii. The coin was the circulatory system of the entire empire, and for nearly 250 years, it held its value. Then the empire got expensive. By the 1st century AD, Rome's ambitions had outgrown its revenues. Think about what it cost to run an empire at its peak. A standing army of 400,000 soldiers, each one needing daily pay, food, weapons, armor, and a pension upon retirement. An empire stretching 5,000 kilometers from Hadrian's Wall in Britain to the Euphrates River in modern Iraq, requiring roads, forts, supply chains, and garrisons. Then add the emperors themselves. The great building projects, the Colosseum, the baths, the aqueducts, the bread and circuses that kept the restless urban population pacified, the court, the bureaucracy, the bribes. The Roman state had, in modern terms, a structural deficit. Its expenses consistently threatened to outrun its revenues. There were only 3 ways to solve this problem: conquer new territory and extract its wealth, raise taxes, or debase the currency. Conquest worked brilliantly in the early centuries. When Rome sacked Carthage, it brought back 4,370 pounds of gold. When it defeated the kingdom of Macedon, it brought back so much silver that Roman citizens were temporarily exempted from taxes. War was literally profitable, but by the 2nd century AD, the empire had reached its natural limits. The lands beyond the Rhine and Danube were poor forests. The Parthian Empire in the east was too strong to conquer. There was nowhere left to loot, at the scale Rome had become accustomed to, so emperors looked inward, and they found their answer in the mint. Here's how you steal from an entire civilization without anyone noticing, at least not immediately. You call in all the old coins, you melt them down, you add a little more copper, a little less silver, you stamp them with the same face, the same inscription, the same official weight, and you send them back out into the economy. The process is called currency debasement, and Rome perfected it into an art form. Under the Emperor Nero in the 1st century AD, the denarius was already being clipped, its silver content reduced from 95% to about 90%. A small change, barely noticeable. Under Marcus Aurelius in the late 2nd century, an emperor famously remembered as a philosopher king and the last of the 5 good emperors, the silver content dropped to around 75%. Even the most virtuous rulers, when faced with an empire under siege and a treasury under pressure, reached for the same tool. But the real collapse came in the 3rd century, the period historians call the crisis of the Third Empire. 50 years of almost continuous civil war, plague, economic collapse, and external invasion. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome had at least 26 different emperors. Most of them were assassinated. Every new emperor needed to pay his army to stay in power. Every payment required money, and the fastest way to get money was to debase the coin. By 268 AD, the denarius, once 90% silver, had fallen to less than 5% silver content. The coin was essentially bronze, with a thin silver wash so light it wore off within days of circulation. A coin that once meant something had become a promise nobody believed. This is where history becomes physics. When you flood an economy with currency that contains less and less real value, you don't create wealth. You redistribute it from citizens to the state. Every debased coin the government spends is, in effect, a hidden tax. The soldier receives his pay in full, but the merchant who sells him bread knows those coins are worth less than they were last year, so he raises his prices. And so inflation arrived in Rome, not the gentle, manageable inflation of modern economies, but something catastrophic. In Egypt, where we have unusually detailed papyrus records of prices, the cost of wheat stayed roughly stable for centuries under the early empire. By the 3rd century, it was multiplying year over year. By the early 4th century, prices had increased by a factor of 50 compared to what they had been 2 centuries before. The Roman state itself could feel the ground shifting. Tax collections, traditionally paid in coin, started producing coins worth less than the paper they weren't even printed on. Soldiers demanded payment in food, land, or goods rather than worthless copper masquerading as silver. The market, as markets always do, adapted to reality rather than pretense. Barter re-emerged in an empire that had spent 500 years building a sophisticated monetary economy. Local economies fragmented. Long-distance trade, the engine of Roman prosperity, collapsed because nobody could agree on what anything was worth. The Emperor Diocletian, who came to power in 284 AD and tried desperately to stabilize the empire, issued his famous edict on maximum prices in 301 AD. It was one of the most ambitious price control attempts in history. It listed maximum prices for over 1,000 goods and services, from wheat to haircuts to a day's labor for a sewer cleaner. The penalty for charging more: death. It didn't work. Merchants simply withdrew from the market rather than sell at a loss. Goods disappeared from shelves. The edict was eventually abandoned. You cannot legislate reality. And the reality was that Rome had destroyed the information system its economy depended on. It is easy to talk about debasement as an abstraction. Percentages of silver, graphs of inflation, imperial edicts. But behind every economic statistic is a human life. Consider the Roman soldier. In the 1st century AD, a legionary earned 225 denarii per year, enough to live comfortably, save modestly, and retire with a land grant. By the 3rd century, nominal pay had been raised repeatedly. On paper, soldiers were being paid more than ever, but they were eating less, because the coins they received were worth less, because the bread they bought cost more, because every raise they received was immediately eroded by the inflation their own government had caused. Consider the small farmer. He sold his grain for denarii, stored those denarii through the winter, and used them to buy seed, tools, and labor in spring. When inflation ran at 30, 40, 50% a year, those saved coins bought less with every passing month. The entire logic of saving, of deferring consumption today to enable production tomorrow, broke down. Consider the merchant. He signed a contract to deliver goods in 6 months at an agreed price, only to find that by delivery day, the coin he received was worth half what it was when the deal was struck. Long-term contracts became impossible. And without long-term contracts, complex trade networks, the kind that had connected Roman Britain to Roman, Egypt to Roman Syria, collapsed into shorter, simpler, less efficient local arrangements. The Roman middle class, the merchants, craftsmen, and traders who had built their lives on monetary stability, was essentially wiped out. Not by war, not by plague, by the slow-motion destruction of the unit of account they had organized their lives around. By the time Constantine the Great unified the empire in the early 4th century, Rome faced a choice: continue the monetary spiral or attempt radical reform. Constantine chose reform. In 312 AD, he introduced the solidus, a new gold coin struck at 72 to the pound with a consistent purity of about 99% gold. The solidus was extraordinary. It would remain the dominant currency of the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, for over 700 years. Medieval European merchants called it the dollar of the Middle Ages. It was so stable, so trusted, that it survived the fall of Rome itself. But here's the tragedy: the solidus was not available to ordinary Romans. Gold coins were for elites, large merchants, government payments. The common economy, wages, bread, local trade, still ran on bronze and copper coins of debased value. Constantine stabilized the currency for the wealthy, while the poor continued to suffer inflation. In doing so, he didn't solve Rome's monetary crisis. He bifurcated it: one economy for those who could hold gold, another economy for those who couldn't. Sound familiar? The Western Empire continued to deteriorate. The tax base shrank as the middle class disappeared. The army, underpaid, increasingly recruited from non-Roman peoples who had even less loyalty to the institution, grew unreliable. Provincial governors increasingly acted as independent warlords. In 476 AD, the last Roman emperor in the West, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain. He wasn't killed. He was considered too insignificant to bother with. The empire that had once commanded the entire Mediterranean world ended, not with a battle, but with a shrug. Now here is the part that should make you uncomfortable, because everything Rome did, the modern world has a version of. We don't debase coins by adding copper to silver. We have something more sophisticated and more invisible. Central banks create money digitally. Governments run structural deficits, spending more than they collect in taxes, financing the difference by issuing bonds that central banks sometimes purchase with newly created currency. The mechanism is different. The dynamic is identical. When the Federal Reserve engaged in quantitative easing, buying trillions in government bonds and creating dollars to pay for them, it was doing in digital form what Gallienus did in physical form in 260 AD. The result was similar too. Asset prices inflated first because newly created money flows first to financial markets. Then consumer prices followed. The inflation surge of 2021 and 2022, the highest in 4 decades, was the delayed consequence of monetary expansion. The difference, and it is important, is that modern fiat currency is backed by institutional trust in a way Roman coinage was not. The dollar is not pegged to silver. It is pegged to confidence in the United States government and Federal Reserve, an intangible but powerful anchor that Rome lacked. But confidence is not permanent. It must be maintained, and it is maintained, ultimately, by not abusing it. Rome's emperors told themselves that just a little more debasement would solve this crisis. Then the next crisis. Then the one after that. Each step was rational in isolation. The system was irrational in aggregate. The lesson of Rome is not that empires collapse. Empires always collapse eventually. The lesson is how they collapse, gradually, through 1,000 small decisions that each seemed reasonable at the time, until the accumulated weight of those decisions brought the whole structure down. The denarius didn't die in a single dramatic moment. It degraded quietly, year by year, emperor by emperor, a little less silver each time, until one day the merchants and soldiers and farmers looked at the coin in their hands and realized this means nothing. And when money means nothing, everything it was holding together starts to come apart. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with a precision that should terrify anyone paying attention. The question for every society is the same one Rome faced: how much can you borrow from the future before the future runs out of patience? Rome borrowed too much, too fast, for too long, and the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever seen dissolved, not into conquest, but into irrelevance. If this gave you a new way to think about money and power, subscribe, because history has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.